trigger warning. This story includes child abuse, kidnapping, violence, attempted coercion, emotional manipulation, and references to pornography. Reader discretion is advised. The nursery lights at St. Nicholas hummed like a distant engine. Fluorescent, impartial, they bleached the faces of exhausted nurses and the pale scrub of a doctor who had already washed his hands too many times that night. Amanda Okoro lay in a hospital bed, salt of sweat on her lip, palms pressed to a belly now empty of its sure, loud presence. She had been 65 the month she decided to carry a child that the world said she had no business carrying. In the vast quiet of the maternity ward, amid beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic, she imagined the life she would bequeath. A small, stubborn warmth who would tether her to something softer than balance sheets and boardrooms. Outside the partition, in the corridor, the twin of Amanda's life moved with the practiced calm of someone for whom choices had always been a currency. Amarka Okoro, twin sister, mirror with a crooked smile, kept her hands at her sides, but every muscle in her face was a calculation. She had been escorted back into Amanda's orbit that night, with a dozen polite reasons and a single, patient grievance. The resentment between them was not sudden. It had lived in the corners of family dinners, in boardroom ambushes, in sibling glances that weighed years like stones. Now it had sharpened into a plan. "Just watch," Amarka said to the nurse who was leaving the post. Her voice was soft, and she folded a folded hospital blanket into a triangle as if arranging a talisman. The nurse nodded and left. Dr. Admi paused in the doorway, as if to catch the last thread of a conversation, and found instead a room emptied of witnesses. The corridor reclined with the steady, unremarkable hum of hospital life. It made for good cover. Amanda's mind was fogged with morphine and the relief that follows labor. When she first opened her eyes, a child was in her arms, small, palms clenched, a tiny mouth that nursed with a blunt determination. The nurse told her the newborn was strong, beautiful, and healthy. Amanda's tears were the overflow of every fortune she'd spent buying a lie of permanence. She touched the baby's ear and felt, in that small cartilage, the possibility of a future she had finally earned. In the next room, under the watch of a different nurse, another infant lay quiet, eyes clouded and unreactive. This baby wore a thin respiratory mask. The tiny chest rose in shallow, controlled breaths. Someone whispered, "Optic anomaly," and a chart that meant, "We need to consult." No father was present. No wealthy hand smoothed a brow. There was instead the slow, secretive movement of a sister with a plan. There are moments in life whose importance is clear only in retrospect. The way someone stands at a threshold, the choice to look away, the sound of a nurse's ankle boot against linoleum. In the sterile glare, a hand passed a sleeping bundle from one set of arms to another. Dr. Admi folded his face into professional calm on camera, though he felt like a man who had signed a check in the dark. He told himself he would be paid, that this would be a one-time erosion of his ethics for a reward he could justify later. Amarka's eyes were trained on the baby she desired to hold, and for whom she had already constructed a life in her mind. Her children, Chisholm and Emma, were waiting in the car, eager, entitled and patient. Amarka had never forgiven Amanda for being the family talisman, because where Amanda had long possessed spotlight and fortune, Amarka had only hunger. The swap was a closing of accounts. When the two infants were moved, the corridor registered only the faintest ripple. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past the door. A pager emitted a thin, universal bleep. Dr. Admi felt the weight of those small moments, like a stone sliding in his pocket. He was not cruel. He was a man who had lost patience with the slow accrual of bills and small mercies. He took the envelope with a hand that trembled, but did not hesitate. Amanda cradled the baby she believed to be hers and sang the lullaby her mother had once hummed. The child did not open its eyes like other newborns did, but something about the way it curled into her chest made her feel foolishly that this was the shape of what she needed. She named him Peter because the sound felt like forgiveness. When the pediatrician later explained, with practiced candor and medical jargon that rolled like stones, that Peter's eyes were not responding, that further testing would be required, her grief dripped and dried into a different kind of love. She would raise this child. She would learn him. Amarka left the hospital carrying a white swaddled package that cried only once in the night. She left with a smile that looked like relief. No one saw her step into the rain and hand the bundle to a woman she had hired, an arrangement Amarka had set days before, a small donation to a remote orphanage and a promise of anonymity that would carry a child out of view and into a life hampered by lack. The orphanage would call the child Philip, an oddly formal name for a child who would grow up among chipped plates and slow-burn boredom. Amarka told herself she was correcting a cosmic mistake. She told herself the child would fare better away from the hard, cold corridors that a woman's wealth could build, but not the tenderness of family. In the weeks after the birth, Amanda's mansion became a museum of echoes. The silver on her dining room still caught the moonlight like trapped fish. She walked rooms that had no purpose now, fingers trailing the grain of mahogany panels as if to find where a heartbeat used to be. Managers who had once deferred with greasy smiles now traded secrets in her name while she went to appointments, shuffled papers, signed with numbed hand. The board, once a line of pillars beneath her, leaned away when she preferred to be alone. Business that had been her armor became a weight she could not lift. Ledgers grew like untended vines, mistakes proliferated, and contracts once neatly folded opened like wounds. Chisholm moved into Amanda's service with the casual brutality of a man who had been denied and intended to take. He was Amarka's son, broad-shouldered, with hands that learned quickly how to shape a room to his mood. In public, he wore a conciliatory mask. At night, behind the smooth, locked doors of the estate, he tested the limits of Peter's world. He liked to see what he could break. For reasons he could not articulate even to himself, cruelty was sensible. He chased a laugh like a dog after a thrown stick, pleasure in domination, a taste of power he had only caught in scraps before. Peter's life at the mansion was a constellation of small, careful routines. Amanda learned to read his footsteps the way others read gestures. She had a way of showing him the house night by night, teaching him where furniture hid and where the sun warmed the wooden staircase in the afternoon. Peter memorized the sound of the spill of rain down the north gutters and the exact moment the great doors clicked at midnight when someone left in anger. He loved the cadence of a clock that Amanda wound each week, and he loved the way Amanda hummed in the morning when she prepared a thin porridge that tasted like safety. Meanwhile, in a cramped two-room house by the auto shop, Jacob kept his hands in oil because grease had a way of staying when people left. He had known poverty not as a theory, but as an ache between ribs, as a childhood season that arranged his life around what could be fixed for next week. Mariam, his wife, taught Sunday school and kept a ledger of prayers and debts. Their daughter Helen was small enough to sit on Jacob's lap without the weight of the world showing on her face. Jacob had not been present for the exchange at St. Nicholas. He had left the city for work that night, and in the days after, when Amanda called him, he froze. He was the boy's father on paper, perhaps, his name on a line that no one read unless a hand needed ink. But he had not been the man who signed up for the long haul. There had been a fling. There had been promises made in low light. There had been a desperation born of youth. Jacob had no illusions about the life he could offer a child in a mansion. He had a toolbox and a throat thick with apologies. When Amanda first called him, her voice a cautious bell, he told himself he'd help as he always helped, with silent transactions, slipping an invoice paid here, a favor called in there. He was a mechanic who fixed things, He was not the sort of man who believed the world would insist a child belonged to him. When he finally went to the hospital, clutching a bouquet of cheap flowers that looked like contrition, Amanda looked at him with a fatigue that had nothing to do with sleep. "You should have been there," she said, not yet accusing, but hollowed. Jacob had to find his footing against the tilt of her disappointment. He found a man who could say practical things. He would help with appointments. He would come when called. He would not interfere with the privacy Amanda had bought with a life of competence and money. She accepted this constancy the way someone accepts a handrail on a stair. She is no longer sure she can climb. But constancy is a fragile thing. Jacob's family held him with a different gravity. Mariam's eyes, in the evenings, traced the oil stains on his palms. Helen would fall asleep in a chair with her head back, blissfully unaware of how precarious life had been for them. Jacob's choices were being chewed by the teeth of obligation. Do you fix the radiator that keeps Helen warm at night, or go to the mansion and put your shoulder to someone else's grief? Mariam kept a quiet ledger of bruises and debts in her head. One afternoon she told him, soft as prayer, that no man could be two places at once. She asked for a decision by the weight in his hands. Time folded. Peter grew into a child who could navigate a house like a blind map, whose laughter sounded like water in a well. Philip, by contrast, received the bare strings of a life at St. Bridget's orphanage, a distant place with paint peeling and nuns who measured compassion in rationing. He learned to find pleasure in stolen books and in the hush of the orphanage's small library, where a donated encyclopedia sat like a sunken treasure. He possessed an intelligence like a slow-lifting curtain, attentive, hungry, making plans in the margins. The orphanage staff gave him a name and a history of neglect that would follow him into his nightmares and into his clever hands. Years layered like onion skins, Amanda's company suffered. Managers she once trusted appointed themselves guardian angels of her assets, but their vigilant care was a hollow mimicry that let profits leak. Contracts lost, investments bungled, reputations quietly undermined. These were small-scale treacheries that went unnoticed until the ledger bled. Amanda's grip on power loosened in ways that were not spectacular, but corrosive. There were shareholder meetings with thin apologies and teeth set for profit. She found groups of investors whispering about the woman who had chosen late motherhood, about the possibility she could no longer lead. The phone calls stopped being warm. Amarka's life improved in increments. She had never been content with scraps. With the child she had placed in the orphanage, she acted as a presence in the shadows, sponsorship stamps, checks redirected, a philanthropic smile when cameras wandered near. Her public persona became a quiet crusader for disadvantaged children, a woman who seemed to atone with donations while privately revising the family ledger to add herself where Amanda had been. Her sons, particularly Chisholm, learned publicly to offer condolences and private to extend hands that probed for leverage. Chisholm's cruelty was deliberate, a rehearsal of future control. He discovered he could nudge Peter into missteps, then watch Amanda flinch. He would send a new toy with a jagged edge to see if the blind child's hands would notice, and he would laugh at the small, private panic he could start in a house that claimed to shelter a mother's heart. Sometimes he stood in the doorway of the sitting room and made a show of reading legal documents he did not understand, raising the possibility that Amanda's fortune was a house with doors marked open to bidders. Jacob's passivity curdled into consequence. He was beaten once, not by accident, but as a message. A pair of men, big, unremarkable, hired hands of threats, found the auto shop when Jacob closed shop for the night. They roughed him against a rusted car hood until the oil under his nails tasted metallic. It was not the first time his choices had come up against the sharp edge of the family's reach, but it was the first time his wife watched his face drain and refused to tuck it back into the safe closet of excuses. The beating happened over a Tuesday. The sky had threatened rain and then withheld it. Jacob went to work early that day, as he always did, and stayed late polishing the undercarriage of a town vehicle. He was tired. The men came in like a clean piece of weather, no small talk, just a command. "Tell her to stop," they said, though tell her was only a small part of their directive. They left him shaken and whittled, and when Mariam saw the bruise bloom along his jaw, the calm in her face shattered into practical anger. "You cannot go on as if nothing is happening," she said, folding the wet towel across his cheek. Helen knelt at his feet and tried to unhook his boots with fingers more used to crayons than threats. Jacob's shame was a physical thing. He carried it to the mansion one afternoon when Amanda called to ask him to pick up a prescription. She stood on the marble steps, hands white around the bag she'd been given by the hospital. For a breath, the architecture of wealth contested his bruise. He wanted to explain, to say he had been scared. He wanted to tell her that he had been frightened to lose both his family and a possible future with the child. Instead, he brought the small, practical object across her palm and watched as the bruise darkened in the light that filtered down the stairwell. Amanda saw the bruise, and something in her broke not into anger, but into a cold alarm. That bruise was not only on Jacob, it was on her living room, on her failure to keep the house free of sharp edges. The realization that her decision to trust a sister had opened a door through which violence could enter her home settled like a frost. She felt lost then in a way that had nothing to do with money, an erosion of control so subtle and comprehensive that it found purchase in the laugh of the staff and the shuffling of the board. At night, she sat on the veranda and listened to the way the city sounded different depending on which room doors were open. Inside, managers made small, conservative decisions that seemed to betray mammoth greed. Outside, a car with tinted windows slowed nearly every evening. No coincidence. She began to notice patterns, an extra signature on a contract, a bank transfer that had been roundabout underneath legitimate expenses. She called people in and asked questions that managers should have already answered. Their answers were precise and unhelpful. She made a list. Peter's days continued in a tender stubbornness. He learned to tie the sound of the house to narrative anchors. The creak in the third-floor corridor meant a maid would arrive in 5 minutes. The echo of heels meant someone had come to eat dinner and bring gossip. He liked to be put at Amanda's feet while she worked, and he would listen to her voice because it was a map for what the world was like when someone loved you. There were small cruelties he could not name, an extra spanking here, a shove there, a night the television was left on to blare a program whose images he could not parse, but whose sound left him restless. He responded to these as a child responds to weather he cannot predict. He did not understand motives, only outcomes. Yet he loved Amanda with the ferocity of someone who had been gathered from ruin. As pressure mounted, Amanda's control slipped in ways that were both mundane and profound. Shareholders called meetings. A once loyal PR manager leaked a private memo to a national paper that hinted at instability. Vendors began to tighten their terms. The mansion, which had been Amanda's fortress, became less a fort and more a film set where props were rearranged with a new hand. People who had once bowed now spoke with a lowered, practical tone. Amanda felt the meeting of her life and business as a tide she could no longer dam. Her nights turned to quietly watching Peter sleep, then to paging through the board pack that meant the difference between a sale and a ruin. She hired a private auditor, someone whose face she did not know but whose competence came recommended by an old friend. The auditor's report was not dramatic. Improper authorizations here, misfiled contracts there. Together they found signatures that did not match, payments that had been authorized in duplicate. The ledger painted a slow theft, a siphon small enough not to be noticed for months, and precise enough to have been planned. Jacob, meanwhile, began to feel the shape of his own anger. The bruise on his face was not only a red mark, but a reminder of the one thing he could not afford to lose: his family's quiet safety. Mariam paced the floor at night and reconsidered the way their life had tilted toward other people's problems. She had thought of Amanda's child as a charity need they could carry lightly, not a person whose life would demand they, too, risk themselves. Helen found herself sitting in the hallway and listening to her parents argue in soft voices she had no place hearing. The day an unsigned envelope arrived at Amanda's desk, with a shred of a photograph and a message that said, "We can unmake this." The air around the mansion hummed with a new tension. The photograph was of the baby that had been handed out into the rain, Philip, with a scribble of a date she'd seen before, the night of her labor. The message was a whisper that someone could undo what had been done, and a threat that the people who had set the swap in motion could do more than take a name. They could unravel a life. Amanda took the photograph to Jacob first, more out of habit than strategy. He looked at the photograph and felt something inside him that was not merely curiosity, but a loud, oppressive sense of missed duty. He could see in Philip's sharp eyes a reflection of what might have been had he not made small compromises. For the first time in years, he felt the tilt of a decision move toward action. He made a promise to himself that he would do more than pray. He would find out. This new resolve did not arrive like a heroic epiphany. It arrived as a slow consolidation. Calls at night, conversations with his cousin who knew people at the harbour, an old friend who still remembered the hospital's name as the place better for births than for scandals. He started to go to Amanda's house more often, not because he coveted the room, but because he could no longer stand the idea that a child might belong to a different family than the one who had sired him. He promised Mariam that he would be careful. Mariam promised nothing. She watched him with an alarm she could not hide. Chisholm watched Jacob in the way scouts watch prey. He noticed the way Jacob's jaw clenched when certain topics were brought up, the way he lingered at the doorway. He took pleasure in taunting Jacob publicly. Small humiliations that made Jacob recede, that privileged their own sense of dominance. The men who had beaten Jacob were not the only mechanism of intimidation. There were phone calls with silence on the other end, envelopes with cash that spoke of bribery without visible hands, and a clear message: keep your place. The first block of this story closes with a moment of quiet that feels like a held breath. Amanda in the grand parlor, the photograph of the child tucked under her palm, and Jacob standing in the doorway with a bruise half-healed and a new hardness in his face. Outside, a storm was building that had nothing to do with the weather. It would demand loyalty and courage in a measure neither of them had yet had to muster. If this twist surprises you, hit like and leave your thoughts below. Tell us who you think will move first. After that evening, things accelerated in increments that felt like narrative, but were only life pressing on a small, decisive seam. Amanda asked for the hospital records. The medical office clerk hesitated and said such files were archived. He mentioned retention policies and then, in a softer voice, an alternate avenue. Backup footage stored off-site, accessible only by formal request. Amanda's auditor sent a terse email that read like a summons. She felt both hope and the cold of a long bureaucratic night. Amarka continued to smile at charity events, to lean into photo ops with children whose faces she had only recently learned. She sat on panels about maternal care and gave interviews about her devotion to vulnerable youths. On camera, she had the sincerity of someone who had learned how to fabricate remorse. Off camera, she met with people who made decisions in rooms that smelled like leather and coffee. She kept her hand on the contract of influence in ways both subtle and firm. The family had become a chessboard with pieces arranged by skill, and she intended to checkmate. Jacob, newly decided, found the mechanics of the underground more accessible than he'd anticipated. He called in favors, met a woman who kept tabs on the orphanage in the northern district, and accepted a small, guarded promise. If the child was placed there, I'll know how to find him. He did not yet understand the full reach of the Okoro family. He imagined a confrontation and saw himself walking in like a man baptized by righteousness. For a few nights, he slept badly, because courage is not a restful thing. A small, sharp incident pulled threads tighter. One evening, while Peter was playing with a wooden train, Chisholm walked past with a smirk and swept the toy into the dust. The child's hands, trained to find the world by feel, froze. Peter began to stutter, not with words but with a sound that betrayed panic. Amanda's voice came like an order then, gentle but precise, and she told Chisholm to leave. He laughed and left, but the message had been sent. Amanda's authority flared like a match, brief, bright, and then gutters. Her rebukes did not carry weight with personnel who had grown used to whispering about her decisions like idle gossip. Her anger, private and scalding, found no purchase in boardrooms. Jacob watched the incident from the corridor and felt the world tilt under his feet. He had always fixed things. He had always put a socket in and made it work. For the first time, he wanted to fix a system. It felt bigger than him. He pressed his palms to a wall and felt the grain of plaster under his fingers, as if seeking a point of leverage. The first outward violence that would change the course of everything came later that month. Jacob was followed home one dusk after a meeting with a contact who said he might know where Philip had been placed. Two men in a rusted sedan cut him off on the narrow street. He thought they wanted money. They wanted a message. They delivered it in a way that was meant to be final, but only left him more conscious of how vulnerable he had become. He came back to Mariam's kitchen, the bruise on his temple blooming like a bruise on fruit, and found Helen drawing at the table, oblivious. Mariam's hands were steady as she iced a bitter tea and asked the kind of questions a person asks when the stakes have narrowed to simple survival. "Are you going to stop?" she asked, because the alternative seemed to both of them faintly like martyrdom. Jacob could not stop. He had begun to taste the possibility of a different life for the boy he might father, one that would not blink at him and call him sir when he entered a room, and he could not return willingly to smallness. His decision hardened, like a tool tempered in fire. He told Mariam he would keep going, but he would be smart. He promised to work his connections, to look for legal ways to access records, to avoid front-page confrontations. In the evening, when the house settled and Peter's hands were curled in sleep, Amanda sat at the window and watched her gardens shiver in the wind. She had lost public control of the company, yes, but she also felt the private losing, the sense that family itself had fissured. Her sister had used a hospital like a stage. Her nephew had learned to enjoy the cruelty of other people's pain. Her son, if he were alive, was somewhere belongings to other names. It was a loss of the narrow private circle she had fought for. Jacob's small acts of leadership began to show up in the ways he asked questions of the right people. He learned to call the archive office and to ask for records in the bland language bureaucracy recognized. He learned to listen for the hesitations, the coughs, the small tell of corruption. He discovered the name of a mid-level nurse who had been relieved of duty the year of his son's birth for inappropriate conduct, an item on a personnel file he could use to assemble a narrative that would not look like rumor. He started to meet with Amanda in the afternoons in the library and to chart the thin, brittle map of how they might proceed. Amarka, sensing that the ground was shifting under the edges of her design, tightened her smile and arranged a dinner at which she served a cake and expressed concern about Amanda's capacity to run the company. She invited a mix of people, some who had always orbited Amanda's design, and some who had only recently learned the value of being near money. She held the room with the kind of precise charm that made alliances invisible and quietly total. Amanda left the dinner hollow in the chest, and more alone than she'd been before the baby was born. On the last night before the next push, an action that would break the veneer and send legal papers and reputations into a storm, Jacob found himself in a small office across town, across from a weary woman named Sister Amaka, who ran the Northside orphanage. She remembered receipts and the feel of someone pressing an infant into her hands in the rain. She remembered a woman with a voice like practice. "I took him in because he was left at my gate," she said, and the way she said it made the name Philip, once a child, come alive in Jacob's chest. She gave him a photograph she had kept in a tin box, and the address scribbled on a page that had been in the seam of an old Bible. The tin box had a photograph. The photograph showed a child with a smile like a knife in the sun. Jacob held it in his palms as if it contained oxygen. He felt a cautious happiness, the tremor of a thing that could be true. He felt a responsibility he had not expected to lift itself from the floor. He knew, with a small, animal certainty, that he would find Philip. He also knew he would have to be ruthless in a way that made his hands shake. Night closed with Amanda at one window and Jacob at another, both watching the same city and imagining different futures. The mansion felt both like fortress and cage, a contradiction Amanda could not solve. The shop smelled like oil and the cheap coffee Jacob liked, and it felt like home, even as it could not become a battlement against the Okoro family's reach. Between the two of them, a tenuous partnership was forming. She, with the legal muscle of a life of resources and the weight of failing authority. He, with the streetwise contacts and the new resolve that had calcified in his bones. The story at this point had become a kind of geometric pressure, the edges of the family drawing in like the walls of a well, and the two adults at the center trying to decide whether to fill it with more light or to throw stones. The events that would follow, running vehicles, whispered bribes, a fall down a flight of stairs and a blood test that did not line up, had not yet arrived. But the map that led to them was being drawn in small, important strokes. A photograph in a tin box, a bruised jaw, a hand's tremor over a hospital file request, a private donation whispered into the ear of an orphanage matron. In the quiet that followed these revelations, Amanda wrote a letter to herself she would rarely show anyone. In it, she catalogued what she had lost, what she had kept, and the one thing she would not lose, the idea that a child belongs to the truth of his origin. Jacob stood at the edge of a choice that would require courage and strategy he had not used before. Both of them were, in their ways, losing control. Amanda of the smooth certainty of wealth's protective walls, Jacob over the quiet life of a man who prized survival over exposure. Neither of them yet grasped that losing control would not mean defeat, but the opening of a door that demanded leadership in a new, uncertain shape. The stairs were a band of wood and light that morning, catching sun through the high windows and throwing it into a pattern that changed with the hour. Peter knew each notch by sound, the hollow creak of the second step from the top where the maid set a broom at night, the deeper thump near the landing where someone often paused to remove a coat. He was playing the way children do with rules they invent, counting, tapping, the small map of a room in his hands, when Chisholm walked through the parlor like an authority expecting to be obeyed. Chisholm liked to make rooms agree with him. He liked to see how quickly people rearranged themselves around his temper. He liked the small fear that tightened shoulders. That morning he moved with a swagger and a cigarette stub pressed between his lips, and he watched Peter from the edges of his sight like a man cataloguing an asset. He kicked a chair too close to the top of the stairs, not looking as he did it, and the wooden toy train Peter had been using rolled into the gap. Peter reached instinctively, feeling for the shape, and his foot slipped. The fall was sudden, in a way memory sometimes denies. No dramatic sound that could rewrite the story. Only the dull, solid note of bodies meeting stare and the quick, high breath of someone who had not yet learned the geometry of danger. Hands grabbed at air. The staff heard a thump, a woman's cry, then the kind of chaos that rules rooms into motion. Amanda's voice cut through it, sharp, precise at first, then breaking as she knelt beside a child with a face that looked too small for the grief that entered the house in his name. They took Peter in an ambulance that smelled like metal and antiseptic, and the small, terrifying heat of hospital adrenaline. Amanda sat with her hands on her knees, not letting herself move too much, as if motion could shake more loose things from her. Jacob went with them. He rode in the front of the ambulance and watched the city shrink in glass and rain-slick pavement, feeling a cold that had nothing to do with weather. If courage had a face, he told himself, he would find it by doing whatever came next. At the emergency room, the doctors moved in crisp steps that looked deceptively calm. They unwrapped Peter's head, checked pupils with light, murmured, took blood. The sample left a small clinical trail, labels, barcodes, a nurse's careful handwriting, and then the first strange note. The blood work flagged a discrepancy. A lab tech announced it like a small, flustered apology. There were antigens in that sample that did not align with the first quick notes in Peter's chart. The nurse repeated it, eyes glossing the way people do when they feel they are announcing something inconvenient. Amanda heard the words and felt something like a door close. "What do you mean?" she asked, and the medical terms, antibodies, cross-match, typing, tumbled forward. The nurse tried to soften it. The machine had read a blood marker inconsistent with Amanda's immediate sample, the typing not lining up as expected. It was a technical thing, the nurse said. Perhaps contamination, perhaps a clerical error. Dr. Admi arrived pale at the edges, professional in his scarf of calm that had been stretched thin in recent months. He told them to wait for a confirmatory panel. In the corridor, Jacob watched Dr. Admi's fingers drum a rhythm Amanda had seen before. Too busy, too nervous. The doctor answered too quickly when the nurse asked whether such a mismatch could be caused by a sample swap. He said anything was possible. He said human error. He said an array of neutral things that had the function of putting time between the present and the moment the truth could land. Amanda did not wait for the soothing language. She had been patient in ways that cost her more than money. She demanded a full analysis, chain of custody documentation for every sample taken that morning, and she had the presence of mind to ask for every form completed in the hours after her delivery. If the lab was a place of neutral machines, then the forms were its memories, and she intended to hold those memories up to the light. The hospital stalled. They cited retention policies and internal audits. Families had rights, they said, and process. Amanda's auditor, a woman with a face like exact arithmetic, was already on the phone. She invoked counsel, the hospital's liability, the reputational cost. The hospital found itself pulled into a procedural trench that had little room for the casual corruption it had allowed in the past. At the same time, Dr. Admi made one private call that bled into damp desperation. He told the person on the other end that everything was quiet for now, but the machines were making odd noises, and a candle had been lit that might burn him. He used words like exposure and ruin, and then softer, "I was paid." His breath came thin. For months he'd been a man whose bills had crept like vines, and a hand had offered him a way out. In exchange, he'd made a choice that did not feel like morality so much as commerce. Now the ledger had opened other pages. The confirmatory tests came back and refused the easy answer. The blood typing hadn't matched. It wasn't a clerical slip. The lab director, a woman who preferred lab coats to headlines, placed a private call to Amanda's auditor. "We need to compute proper steps," she said. "Chain of custody, swabs, secure custody of all samples. We must treat this as potential evidence." The word evidence shifted the temperature in the room. It made liability real and actionable. It pulled lawyers and police into a place they had only hesitated to enter when Amanda had been a woman with fortress-like resources. Now she had the right to those resources and the moral right to press. Jacob and Amanda moved in tandem. She issued a formal request for hospital surveillance footage from the time of her delivery. He called a friend who worked at a records office and asked about off-site archives. The hospital's front desk clerk gave them the same answer. Routine retention 18 months, backup stored off-site. But the hospital's deputy administrator, whose eyes had learned to calculate risk, suggested they would need a subpoena. The weight of formal justice sat like a stone on the table once again. Amanda could buy attorneys. Subpoenas were the language of institutions. She did not wait for the slow slide of court orders. Amanda's auditor prepared a legal package, the kind that read like a hatchet and an olive branch together. They filed for an expedited order to preserve footage and to compel the hospital to release any archived tapes pending review. The court gave them a preservation order within 48 hours. Legal doors had thin hinges if they were hammered correctly. Meanwhile, Jacob took to the streets. He found a man who had once worked nights in the hospital archives and paid him for a cigarette and a name, an off-site storage facility on the industrial edge of town, a place that kept magnetic backups, odd, old-fashioned things that had fallen out of use but had been kept for redundancy. The ex-worker remembered a shipment date, a particular tape labeled with the words, "Maternity Night Shift." He felt something like guilt loosen in his chest as he handed Jacob the address. Jacob promised the man nothing but a return for a favor and the quiet hope that good could come of what had been wrong. When they reached the warehouse, they found boxes and the smell of dust, and the sense that things placed in corners wanted to be forgotten. Jacob's hands, used to the heft of tools and car parts, handled the tapes carefully. They were aged, but readable. The archivist at the facility was used to lawyers asking for things. He was not used to a woman with a fortune and a battered mechanic side by side in his doorway. He signed the preservation receipt. Chain of custody was now a thin legal thing that moved with a crispness Jacob had not known papers could carry. Back at the hospital, the preservation order had been served. A hospital lawyer called, firm and polite, to say they would comply. Dr. Admi, when told the legal step had been taken, made a decision he would later try to explain. He took a breath. Then he walked to the director of clinical services. He told her, in a voice that was low and pleading, that there might be something on the maternity cameras that would not be comfortable. He asked for an arrangement, a delay, anything to manage the scandal. The clinical director, who had spent years keeping a balance between reputation and truth, told him the law had teeth now. Hospitals were not like homes where secrets could be hidden under rugs. Things had to be produced. At the retrieval room, where someone in a hospital would play back footage for clinicians reviewing a case, an old monitor hummed when the tape was loaded. It showed the maternity ward in the small hours. Babies swaddled like small moons under heating lamps, nurses moving in measured paths. Amanda's exhausted silhouette as she slept in a chair, a shadow that moved with the practiced stealth of a woman who had rehearsed narrative. The footage was not a cinematic reveal with amplified music. It was the dull, steady capture of dull moments that, when stitched together, became damning. Amanda saw herself in the footage the way someone sees an old photograph and recognizes a stranger. She watched her sister's face move across the frame, a tilt, a hand offered, a nurse stepping away. The camera caught the exchange between arms, the passing of one bundle into another set of hands. There was no flourish. The crime's audacity was in its ordinariness. Dr. Admi's hand reached into the frame too, and Amanda watched him brush a band of cloth and check a wrist, as one man checking for signs of life might do. The tape froze in her mind like a splinter. She did not scream. The sound that left her mouth was an animal sound, a small, private thing that surprised her with its rawness. Jacob's hands found hers and squeezed until his own knuckles were pale. For all his softness, he had not known the scale of the betrayal until the film clapped in the dark and made the room smaller. They took the tape to the police with a chain of custody that would make the prosecutor nod. The detective assigned to the case, a woman with a crease of experience at the corners of her mouth, watched the footage twice and then called for warrants. "This appears to be a deliberate act," she said. Her voice was quiet but stern. "We need to interview Dr. Admi. We need to locate the woman with a written receipt. We need to talk to anyone who touched both infants in those hours. Arrests do not happen as in novels. They happen with paperwork, with officers in uniforms knocking at doors, with a legal rhythm that can be painfully slow for victims whose outrage burns hot." But the tape had changed the equation. It had given the detective probable cause. The prosecutor drew lines and authorized arrests. Warrants were prepared. They moved at first light. The raid on Amaka's home was a weathered sort of theater. She had been rehearsing philanthropic words to say at a morning event when uniformed officers arrived. She hid nothing at first, had a posture that assumed influence would turn the key and unlock a different world. But the officers read the warrant and the clinical director's notes and the tape, and their hands were not offering diplomacy. Amaka was told she was under arrest for conspiracy to commit child abduction and fraud. She went quiet in a way that made the room feel thinner. Chisholm, when arrested, tried the bravado that had held him for years. They read him his rights. He started to laugh, then grow angry, then quiet when the reality of handcuffs sank in. Emma, too, was taken to the station for questioning. The cameras had captured him near the nurse's station at the time of the swap. Dr. Admi, who had sat with the weight of his decisions since that night, was tracked down in a motel near the city, his suitcase still by the bed. He attempted to explain with the kind of weak practicalities men use to make moral lapses into business decisions, debts, threats, a promise that would erase bills, but his excuses were small things against the film. The hospital faced inquiry into how such an act could have been arranged under its roof. The clinical director later placed an internal call that would lead to an external investigation. Malpractice, license review, criminal referral. The hospital's veneer of respectability would, in months to come, crack under investigation. Jacob was there at each arrest, not as a triumphalist, but as someone who had become necessary to the operation. He had called witnesses, tracked addresses, and pressed the detective for timelines. The officers came to him more than once for a list of names and for details that only someone from the neighborhood could provide. He stood at the perimeter of the station while Amaka was processed, and when she looked at him across the room, she did not see only a man who had once been intimidated. She saw someone else. He was not the gentle mechanic who had idled in a doorway, hoping for grace. He was a man who had placed himself between a truth and its erosion, and he had done it in public and with paperwork. The orphanage was a place that time had not spent kindly upon. Its paint peeled in broad, lazy flakes. The kitchen was a geography of rationed smiles and what good hands could stretch. Sister Amaka met them on the dusty steps, her palms stiff from years of carrying what had been entrusted to her. She had been used to visitors, donations, reporters, the occasional politician, but the police made the kind of entrance that turned pity into official theater. Philip, with 2 L's on the orphanage paperwork, was small and bright and contained a nervous electricity that had been honed into survival. He had learned the rules of an orphanage: speak when you are spoken to, answer directly, keep your eyes on the surface of conversations, so as not to disturb the adults. When Jacob walked into the yard, he had a photograph in his palm, the same picture his contact had given him months ago. He did not rush. He let the child look, let the child decide whether to care. When they finally placed the photograph against Philip's cheek, he did not weep. He squinted as if to measure the weight of recognition. Jacob crouched and spoke in small, tidy sentences. He did not tell Philip everything. Truth sometimes arrives in measures, and he did not make the moment television ready. He placed a hand on Philip's shoulder and felt the boy's breath break in a way that made him look like a child whose chest had learned to inhale fear the way other children inhaled sugar. Amanda arrived later, bringing a small patterned scarf she knew would smell like home to a child who had worn only institutional scents for years. They placed Philip and Amanda within a few feet of each other and watched. The child was suspicious, the way children made of slow betrayals became. He asked practical questions. He listened to the far smaller things Amanda said, about a garden, about the way rain tasted on the veranda. And he answered, as if cataloguing. The test for the child's origins had to be sterile, formal, and immediate. The police took swabs, sealed vials in evidence envelopes with barcodes that blinked like small clinical stars. The detective read out the chain of custody aloud while they watched, a ritual that would hold when prosecutors later asked whether the evidence had been tampered with. Each seal was signed. Each transport was recorded. Jacob watched every signature as if the ink itself were a plank he needed to walk across. The lab work took time that felt like both an eternity and a blink. Amanda sat in the hospital's small waiting area, knuckles white where she gripped the armrest. Peter's hand found her knee without looking, a silent support. He had the small, sure manner of someone who had been taught to fit pieces together with the patience of the blind. "Will it be him?" he asked in a voice that had learned to ask the world small, necessary things. "I believe so," Amanda said. She did not yet know, but belief had been her engine. Jacob hovered near the edge of legal and domestic spheres, his phone a quiet engine of messages from colleagues and family and police officers. The lab director called, formal and warm at once. "It's a match," she said. "Genetic markers consistent across tests, with a probability of parentage exceeding standard thresholds. We'll forward the full report to the prosecutor." The word match landed with the weight of a small miracle and a large indictment. It opened the possibility of reunification and the necessity of pain. They brought Philip to the mansion in a vehicle that smelled of coffee and evidence markers. The first walk through the great hall changed him in a way that had nothing to do with architecture. He ran his hands along a banister, exploring the wood, tracing spaces other children had never imagined. He touched the same clock that Peter had loved. He listened to the sound of water in the fountain and frowned with concentration. He liked books with small fonts and big ideas. He read in his head the way birds memorize wind. He had intelligence that bent toward the practical. He noticed where light pooled on the rug, where sound echoed, where doors were thin and private. Amanda met him in the nursery, with the thicker sound of the middle-aged and the eager caution of someone who had loved a child not born to her own blood, as if he were the center of her life. Peter was there too, standing with a cane that had been adapted to his small hands. He reached out and felt Philip's cheek and the shape of his jaw, and seemed to register another child in his own domestic geography. The two boys stood because they could not kneel into what the other represented. Words came later. There were reunions that made sense, and others that made no sense at all. Philip stared at the house, and then turned to Jacob in a way that seemed to count the man as part of his edge. "You found me," he said. "You brought me to a room with a fountain." It was not an emotional line so much as an inventory. And it was honest. Jacob, who had spent nights imagining how it would feel to be asked for something by a son who knew him, felt a small, steady tear break and then pass. He did not weep theatrically. He stood, hands in his pockets, and let something like shame and relief trade places. The arrests, when they played out publicly, had complexity. A marker insisted on her version of events to the camera outside the courthouse steps, words crafted to hold in the shallow light of press and sympathy. But in the interrogation room she was quieter. She claimed a rationale that tried to dress cruelty in the cloak of repair. The child would have a better life away from the mansion, she said. She spoke about inequity and family burdens, and in her voice there was a glint that everyone saw as damage control rather than repentance. The prosecutor had a stack of evidence. The tape, the sealed lab reports, financial records showing transfers to hospital staff intended to secure cooperation. The criminal charges were filed in precise cold ink. Chisholm fared worse in public sympathy than his mother. Videos of his casual cruelty to Peter circulated privately and then leaked. Witnesses were called who had seen him use intimidation to bend staff. The evidence painted a man trying on the coat of power and finding it heavy and ugly. His case moved toward trial. Dr. Admi pleaded guilty to accepting a bribe and to falsifying documentation. He offered to testify against Amarka in exchange for a plea deal that would touch his license and open a path to rehabilitation only if he cooperated. The hospital, embarrassed and exposed, opened an internal inquiry and negotiated a settlement that would include funding for the orphanage and a new oversight committee. People called it accountability. Amanda called it small justice. The legal sequence was not the same as emotional healing. Amanda navigated depositions and interviews, and in the courtroom she stood with a dignity that made her look for all the world like a woman who had chosen what mattered in a life and then been forced to defend it. Her empire, she had not entirely reclaimed it, would bear scars. The board restructured, a few managers were dismissed, and auditors moved in like forensic gardeners. Share prices wavered and then steadied. Amanda found, astonishingly, that losing the veneer of absolute command gave her a clarity she had not had in years. She could see what needed tending first, and it was not always the ledger. Jacob's life shifted. Mariam watched the man she had loved change. He came home late sometimes and smelled of courthouse coffee and street briskness. He returned with the kind of quiet that men bring when they've learned the taste of responsibility. Mariam did not immediately reach for a triumphant reconciliation. She watched the contours and the patient truth of him, and she ached in private. Helen, older by a few small years than the gravity of her childhood warranted, befriended Philip with the steady curiosity of those who have known loss, an easy, childlike solidarity. She taught him how to climb into a cardboard box and pretend it was a spaceship. Philip, who had learned to measure happiness by its intensity rather than its consistency, accepted friendship without asking for condition. Peter changed too. He was blind, not fragile. He had a mind that was resilient, and an appetite that made him stubborn in useful ways. He was not erased by Philip's arrival. Amanda made a choice, one that felt like an act of both moral clarity and human compassion, to keep Peter as her son. She had loved him through confusion, and had raised him into a person who loved back without a ledger. She would not trade that. Their household became a smaller democracy. Decisions were argued and owned. Amanda invited Jacob to take a place at the table, literally and figuratively, not as a man seeking favor, but as someone who had become a partner in the construction of truth. He did not take charge the way a conqueror takes a city. He took the lead the way a foreman takes a job, by showing up, naming problems, and organizing people to solve them. He coordinated with counselors for Peter, with tutors for Philip, and with legal advisors for Amanda. He argued for a slow approach to public narrative. Courts would do their work. The family would do theirs. The neighborhood watched. Some saw in Amanda a woman who had fallen and found a way up. Others saw a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth. For Jacob, who had spent a life fixing cars, something fundamental had changed. He had discovered he could function in rooms where law and grief intersected, and that his voice, raw with experience, could be both practical and moral. He walked into meetings with the police and with Amanda's counsel, and spoke without apology. He had earned that right. Amidst this, little things that mattered came to light. Philip read faster than anyone expected. He delighted in finding patterns in the legal documents that an adult might miss. He and Helen argued over whose toy the rocket belonged to, and in their noise, a new normal took shape. Peter, who navigated rooms like a cartographer, taught Philip the way the house smelled during rain and where the lemons were kept. Amanda watched them with a mixture of triumph and a private, abraded grief, the knowledge that years had been stolen that could never be returned. At the courthouse, the prosecutor laid out a case that relied on the clear film, the documented payments, the doctor's confession, and the sworn statements of staff. The defense argued mitigation, pointed to Amaka's misguided belief that she was acting in the child's best interest, and cited family history as context rather than excuse. The judge listened and considered. For the public, the case became a morality play. For the people involved, it was a ledger of small betrayals. When the verdicts came, they were mixed. Dr. Admi accepted a plea that would remove him from practice for years and require community service in health oversight. Amaka was convicted of several counts and sentenced to a term that would give her time to reflect, protect victims, and possibly seek rehabilitation, if she wanted it. Chisholm faced a stiffer sentence for his part in the intimidation and for abuses found during the investigation. The law did what it could. It could not, however, restore the lost years, nor could it erase the subtle theft of childhoods. Amanda did not celebrate. She found a small private solace in the rule of law. It felt like a curtain with the wind going through it, but it was something solid underfoot. She kept her promise to both boys. She would care for Peter and Philip, would keep their daily lives steady, would support therapy and privacy. She also became more public in ways that no PR campaign could have recommended. She spoke about the vulnerability of institutions, about how wealth could not buy tenderness, about how the only thing she coveted now was the chance to be honest and present. Jacob's leadership did not go unnoticed. He was offered a role, informal, unpaid, on a small oversight committee Amanda set up in the wake of the hospital scandal, a group tasked with ensuring the kind of checks that might have saved the children years before. He declined a salaried position that would have made him into a symbol. He wanted instead the practical work, visiting the orphanage to ensure funds were used properly, meeting with local police to streamline responses, helping small organizations navigate bureaucracy. He had found a purpose more complicated and more satisfying than the simple fixes he used to do with a wrench. Mariam watched him, and finally let herself feel some of the pride and some of the loss. They would have to renegotiate a life that had been altered by public events. She asked for space, as a woman has the right to ask, and he provided it with no theatrics. The family, like the property Amanda ran, had been damaged and was being repaired not through the sweep of grand gestures, but through the steady movement of daily care. There were people who would not be so easily redeemed. Amaka's motives were subject to psychoanalysis, in op-eds and legal briefs. But for those who had known her intimately, the act was a culmination of long-standing resentment. Her sister had been both the center and the exclusion she could not tolerate. The court's sentence did not try to understand every nuance. It merely assigned consequence. In her cell, Amaka sometimes had the silence that people who had lost everything have, and sometimes she rehearsed arguments for why she had been forced to act. Rehabilitation would be the long arc of a life, if it came. Chisholm's fate was more concrete. Prison time, loss of reputation, and the slow work of a man learning to live with time and reflection. For Philip and Peter, the aftermath was more immediate and more human. They went to therapy together at first, then found their own rhythms. There were nights when Amanda sat with both of them and felt like a woman balanced on a wire. There were times the wire trembled, and there were times the wire held steady. She did not pretend there would be clean endings. There would be scars. There would be moments of real joy. Months later, on a crisp morning when the garden smelled of citrus and earth, Jacob took Peter and Philip to the mechanic's shop. He wanted the boys to see a world he understood, wrenches, engines, the honest labor of restoring things that had been damaged. They watched as he lifted the hood on an old pickup and explained what each part did. He did not romanticize his work. To him, it was a school of practical patience. Philip took to it with a tiny, fierce focus, counting bolts and asking precise questions. Peter listened more than he spoke, then reached out to run a finger along the edge of the spare tire, content to learn by touch. Later, as Amanda watched them both climb into Jacob's rusted pickup to drive to a place that smelled like oil and childhood, she felt something like peace. She had lost control in the narrow ways that had once defined her power. Her board still turned in suits. Her investors had not forgiven entirely, but had not abandoned her either. She had been humbled. She had been betrayed. But she had also recovered a truth that mattered. That truth was messy and costly, and sometimes needed a poor mechanic with grease on his hands to hold it steady. Jacob, who had begun as a man who fixed what was broken and hid his fear under jokes, had become someone people turned to when the maps of their lives frayed. He did not demand credit. He accepted responsibility with the kind of quiet stubbornness that made people trust him. The police still consulted him on community matters. Amanda still asked his advice about how to structure oversight. The two of them had formed a partnership that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with insistence. Insistence on truth. Insistence on care. There remained threads that the story did not finish. Some figures who knew more about the hospital's corruption kept quiet in the hopes of self-preservation. There were whispers Amaka had contacts beyond the immediate family who might yet surface. The public still debated what money could do to bodies and hearts. The legal appeals and civil suits promised more months of filings, letters and hearings, but the immediate danger had been removed. And two boys who had been harmed now had people who loved them and who would fight for them. On the veranda, one evening when the light softened and the house was full of the low, domestic noise of people cooking and discussing trivialities, Amanda opened the drawer where she kept small things. Photographs, a letter she had written the night after the birth, the tiny blanket she had wrapped around a child she had named Peter. She thought of control as a brittle thing people often mistook for power. She had lost certain kinds of control, the smooth certainty that money could be guardian enough. But she had gained a different kind, the kind rooted in presence and hard decisions and the courage to go after truth no matter the cost. No. Jacob stood at the gate of the garden looking at the children playing, Peter moving with the surety of someone who had learned his world by touch. Philip talking fast about a book he'd found in the library. Helen conducting a play for a toy rocket. He felt the relief of a man who had learned to live inside a larger story. He had been pushed into the lead by necessity and by personal choice. He had stepped into it imperfectly and stayed. Amanda did regain some measure of control, legal, financial, structural, but not in the old absolute style that had defined her before. She had been unmade in modest ways and remade around things that could not be bought. Love, accountability, the stubborn art of repairing harm. Jacob had taken the lead not to dominate, but to hold steady, to organize, to ask the questions others did not ask. He had become, in the language of neighbors and the substance of the family, indispensable. There was one final quiet evening when the two of them sat on the veranda and watched the boys race along paths worn into the grass. "You changed," Amanda said, not triumphantly, but with the small awe of someone who had watched a life tilt and settle. "You led when it counted." Jacob shrugged and looked at the men he had been and the one he was becoming. He thought of the bruise on his jaw, the nights he had sat awake, and the telephone calls that had turned into warrants. "We did," he said. "We kept them." Amanda let the words rest between them. She had lost a kind of control that had been expensive to maintain, and in losing it, she had opened a place where leadership could come from unexpected hands. Jacob had seized that place, not with a desire to rule, but with a will to keep things whole. In that change, the household found a new structure. Not perfect, not absolute, but honest. Outside, the city breathed, and the house settled under the long, complicated sky. Justice had done what it could. The rest would be carried in days of small care. The headline, about a 65-year-old billionaire losing control and a poor mechanic taking the lead, would be printed and debated and eventually file away under history. For Amanda and Jacob and the two boys who now navigated their shared life, the work was quieter and more profound. The work of feeding, of teaching trust, of answering questions without erasing pain. It was the long, careful, essential work of rebuilding. If you want to see how the trial unfolds and whether the family can find lasting peace, subscribe and come back for part 3.